this. The year is 53 BC, and the most powerful empire in the known world is about to suffer its most devastating military disaster. Not from Germanic tribes, not from Gallic warriors, but from an enemy they completely underestimated. Imagine 40,000 of Rome's finest soldiers marching into the desert, confident, disciplined, unstoppable. Now imagine less than 10,000 limping home in defeat. How could this happen? How could Rome, the empire that conquered the Mediterranean, lose so catastrophically to a kingdom most Romans had barely heard of? The name of this disaster? Carrhae. And what happened in that scorching desert would haunt Roman nightmares for generations. But what happened next would change the course of human history forever. Here's what you need to understand about Rome in 53 BC. This wasn't just any empire. This was a military machine that had been perfecting the art of war for centuries. Roman legions were the most feared fighting force on earth, disciplined, organized, and seemingly invincible. But Rome in the 1st century BC was also a powder keg ready to explode. The Roman Republic was dying, though few realized it at the time. 3 men, just 3, controlled the destiny of millions. They called it the First Triumvirate, but it was really nothing more than an illegal conspiracy to divide the known world among themselves. These 3 men, Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Now you've probably heard of Caesar and Pompey. But Crassus? Here's where things get absolutely fascinating. Because Crassus wasn't just Rome's third wheel. He was arguably the most powerful man in the entire Roman world. Picture the wealthiest person you can imagine. Now multiply that by 100. Crassus made Elon Musk look like he was collecting pocket change. Ancient sources claimed he owned over 7,000 talents of silver. That's roughly 200 tons of pure silver. In today's money, we're talking about a fortune worth billions upon billions of dollars. But here's what's incredible about Crassus. He didn't inherit this wealth. He built it through sheer ruthless genius. When Rome's civil wars were tearing the city apart, Crassus saw opportunity where others saw chaos. He bought up property from families fleeing the violence for pennies on the dollar. He created Rome's first fire brigade, but here's the twisted part. He'd only put out fires after he'd bought the burning building from the desperate owner. Crassus understood something that would make him fabulously wealthy. In times of crisis, cash is king. And his military reputation? Let's just say he'd earned it the hard way. When Spartacus and his army of escaped gladiators brought Rome to its knees, who do you think finally crushed the rebellion? That's right, Crassus. He didn't just defeat Spartacus. He crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way as a warning to anyone else who might challenge Roman authority. This was not a man you wanted to cross. But here's the thing about Crassus that would ultimately lead to disaster. For all his wealth, for all his military success, he was consumed by one burning obsession: glory. You see, Caesar was conquering Gaul, adding territory and prestige to his name with every campaign. Pompey had already earned the title Magnus and the Great for his victories in the East. And Crassus, he was just the rich guy. The money wasn't enough anymore. The respect wasn't enough. Crassus wanted what Caesar and Pompey had: military glory that would echo through the ages. He wanted to be remembered not as Rome's banker, but as one of its greatest generals. And that burning ambition would lead him to make the most catastrophic decision in Roman military history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because what's about to unfold is even more incredible. First, let's talk about Rome's enemy in this story. An empire that most Romans knew almost nothing about, but which would prove to be one of the most formidable opponents Rome would ever face: the Parthian Empire. Now, if you're thinking, what now? You're not alone. Most Romans felt exactly the same way. To them, Parthia was just another barbarian kingdom somewhere beyond the civilized world. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Parthian Empire stretched from the Euphrates River all the way to India. It was massive, nearly 3 times the size of the Roman Empire, and it had been around for almost 2 centuries by the time Crassus set his sights on conquest. But here's what made the Parthians truly dangerous. They had perfected a style of warfare that was completely alien to Roman military thinking. Roman armies were all about discipline, formation fighting, and heavy infantry. The legions would march in perfect order, lock shields, and methodically grind down their enemies with superior organization and training. The Parthians, they fought like ghosts. Their army was built around cavalry. Light horsemen who could appear out of nowhere, rain down arrows, and vanish before the Romans could even respond. And their secret weapon? The cataphract. Heavily armored cavalry that could charge like a thunderbolt and smash through enemy lines. It was mobility versus muscle, speed versus strength, and most Romans had never faced anything quite like it. The stage was set, but no one could have predicted what was coming. Trouble was brewing in the triumvirate by 54 BC, and it all came down to one simple fact. 3 ambitious men sharing power is never a recipe for lasting peace. Caesar was making himself famous and rich, conquering Gaul. Every victory added to his legend, and every captured tribe added gold to Rome's treasury. The Roman people loved him for it. Pompey, meanwhile, was consolidating his power base in Rome itself. He was the establishment candidate, the safe choice, the man senators trusted to maintain order. And Crassus was watching both of them pull ahead in the one currency he couldn't simply buy, military glory. You can imagine how Crassus must have felt. Here he was, the man who'd saved Rome from Spartacus, who'd helped put down Catiline's conspiracy, who'd bankrolled half the senators in Rome. And yet he was being overshadowed by his 2 junior partners. It was intolerable. So when his proconsulship of Syria came up, Crassus saw his chance. Syria bordered the Parthian Empire, and border meant opportunity. All he needed was a good excuse for war, and then he could march east and carve out his own conquests. The excuse came in the form of a Parthian prince named Pacorus, who was stirring up trouble along the frontier. Perfect. Crassus could claim he was simply defending Roman interests while he launched what was really a war of naked aggression. But there was a problem. The Roman Senate wasn't exactly enthusiastic about this plan. Here's what's fascinating about the Roman political system in 54 BC. Technically, the Senate still had to approve major military campaigns, and many senators were deeply suspicious of Crassus's motives. Marcus Porcius Cato, imagine the most stubborn, principled conservative you've ever met, then multiply by 10, stood up in the Senate and delivered a scorching speech against the war. "This is nothing but greed disguised as patriotism," Cato thundered. "Crassus seeks not to defend Rome, but to enrich himself with Parthian gold." And you know what? Cato was absolutely right. But here's the thing about being the richest man in Rome. You don't need Senate approval if you're willing to pay the price. Crassus essentially bought his war. He used his massive wealth to pressure senators, bribe officials, and manipulate the political process. Money, as always, talked louder than principle. The Senate eventually authorized his campaign, but barely, and with deep reluctance. And that's when everything started to fall apart. The omens were terrible from the very beginning. When Crassus performed the traditional sacrifices before departing Rome, the priests reported that the entrails were unfavorable, ancient Roman code for "the gods think this is a really, really bad idea." A tribune of the plebs named Gaius Attius Capito actually tried to physically prevent Crassus from leaving the city. He stood at the city gates and pronounced a formal curse upon the expedition, calling down the wrath of the gods on anyone who participated in this unholy war. Crassus brushed aside these warnings with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough money and determination. Big mistake. As his army marched out of Rome in 55 BC, Crassus was at the peak of his power. He commanded 7 legions, roughly 42,000 infantry plus cavalry and auxiliaries. By Roman standards, this was a massive force, easily capable of conquering most enemies. The soldiers themselves were confident, experienced veterans. Many had served in previous campaigns and trusted their commander's reputation. They were Romans, after all, and Romans didn't lose wars, especially not to some unknown barbarian kingdom in the desert. But confidence and reality don't always align, as they were about to discover in the most brutal way possible. Each decision brought them closer to the inevitable. Now, while Crassus was gathering his forces and making his preparations, something equally important was happening on the other side of the border. The Parthian Empire was also preparing for war, but in a way that would catch the Romans completely off guard. The Parthian king, Orodes II, was no fool. He understood exactly what kind of threat Crassus represented, and he was taking it seriously. But instead of meeting Roman strength with Parthian strength, he was planning something much more clever. He divided his forces. While he personally led the main Parthian army north to deal with Armenia, Rome's ally and staging ground for the invasion, he gave command of the force that would face Crassus to a young general named Surena. Now, here's what makes this decision absolutely brilliant from a strategic standpoint. Orodes was essentially saying, "I trust this young commander so completely that I'm giving him the honor of destroying Rome's most celebrated general." And Surena? He was about to prove that trust was completely justified. Picture a man in his early 30s, born into one of Parthia's most noble families, with a natural genius for the kind of mobile warfare that was Parthia's specialty. Surena commanded not just the respect of his soldiers, but their absolute devotion. His force was much smaller than Crassus's army, perhaps 10,000 cavalry and 1,000 camel-mounted archers. By Roman standards, this was barely a skirmishing force. But Surena wasn't planning to fight like a Roman. The moment of truth had arrived. The year is 53 BC, and Marcus Licinius Crassus is standing at the most important crossroads of his entire life. His army, 7 legions of Rome's finest soldiers, has crossed the Euphrates River and entered Parthian territory. There's no turning back now. He's committed to this war, committed to this gamble for glory, committed to this chance to finally prove himself as one of Rome's greatest generals. You can hear the clash of steel echoing across the ancient world as 40,000 Roman soldiers prepare for what they believe will be just another conquest in Rome's endless march toward empire. But Crassus is about to discover that the Parthians fight unlike any enemy Rome has ever faced. The Roman army was built for a very specific type of warfare. Picture the classic formation, heavily armored legionaries in tight formation, shields locked together, advancing methodically across the battlefield like an unstoppable iron machine. It had worked against Gauls, Germans, Spaniards, Greeks, basically everyone Romans had ever fought. The strategy was simple: get close, form up, and grind down the enemy with superior discipline and training. Roman soldiers were the best close combat infantry in the world, and Roman generals had centuries of experience in making this system work. But the Parthians weren't going to let them get close. Surena had been tracking the Roman advance for days, watching their movements, studying their formation. And he'd developed a plan that would exploit every weakness in the Roman system. Here's what's absolutely incredible about what happened next. Surena was going to defeat the most powerful army in the world using tactics that most Romans didn't even consider real fighting. The Romans first encountered the Parthian force near the town of Carrhae, in what's now southeastern Turkey. It was May of 53 BC, and the desert sun was already becoming brutal, something that would play a crucial role in the coming disaster. When Crassus's scouts reported enemy contact, the Roman general must have felt a surge of confidence. Finally, a chance to bring these horse-riding barbarians to battle and show them what Roman steel could do. But when the two armies came within sight of each other, something unexpected happened. The Parthians didn't charge. They didn't form up for battle. They just circled. Picture this scene. 40,000 Roman soldiers in perfect formation waiting for the enemy to attack. And instead of attacking, 10,000 Parthian horsemen begin riding in wide circles around the Roman position, staying just out of javelin range. You can imagine the confusion in the Roman ranks. What kind of battle was this? Where was the enemy charge? Where was the heroic clash of arms that Roman soldiers had trained their entire lives for? Then the arrows started falling. Not just a few arrows, not a scattered volley from nervous archers. We're talking about a continuous, devastating rain of death that fell on the Roman army like a monsoon of steel and wood. Parthian archery was unlike anything in the ancient world. These weren't part-time soldiers who picked up bows when needed. They were professional horse archers who'd been training since childhood to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. And their bows? These were composite bows and made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that could drive an arrow clean through Roman armor at 200 yards. But here's the part that will absolutely blow your mind. The Parthians had solved a problem that had limited archers throughout history. Running out of arrows, Surena had brought a massive baggage train of camels, each loaded down with thousands of arrows. As his horse archers expended their ammunition, fresh supplies were continuously brought forward. The Romans weren't just facing an archery attack. They were facing an artillery bombardment that could continue indefinitely. Roman shields provided some protection, but maintaining a shield wall while under continuous arrow fire is exhausting. Men began to fall, not just from arrows that penetrated their armor, but from the sheer physical strain of holding up heavy shields hour after hour under the blazing desert sun. Crassus realized he had to do something. The traditional Roman response to archery was simple: charge the archers and force them into close combat where Roman superiority would decide the battle. He ordered his son Publius Crassus to take 1,000 cavalry and 4,000 infantry and scatter these annoying horse archers once and for all. This is where things went from bad to catastrophic. Publius was young, brave, and eager to prove himself in his father's campaign. He led his force in a determined charge toward the circling Parthians, confident that once he got close enough, Roman discipline would carry the day. The Parthians appeared to retreat, exactly what Publius wanted to see. His cavalry pressed forward, chasing the fleeing enemy across the desert, getting farther and farther from the main Roman army. But the retreat was a trap. As soon as Publius's force was isolated and extended, Surena sprung his masterstroke. The retreating horse archers wheeled around and resumed their deadly archery, while from hidden positions emerged the cataphracts, Parthia's heavy cavalry. Picture knights in full armor, but 2,000 years before the medieval period. Man and horse both covered in steel scales, wielding 18-foot lances, charging like an avalanche of metal and death. Publius's cavalry was slaughtered. His infantry, caught in the open without support, was systematically destroyed by alternating charges from the cataphracts and arrow storms from the horse archers. And young Publius Crassus, he died with his men, fighting desperately in an impossible situation. But the real test was yet to come. Things were about to get much, much worse for the Roman army trapped in that hellish desert. When the survivors of Publius's ill-fated charge limped back to the main Roman position, they brought with them news that struck the army like a thunderbolt. The young Crassus was dead, his head cut off and displayed on a Parthian spear for all to see. You know what? If you're as fascinated by this incredible story of ancient warfare and human ambition as I am, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us bring more of these untold stories of empires, battles, and human drama to life. Trust me, the best part is still coming. Now, where were we? Oh, right, the moment that would change everything. Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the conqueror of Spartacus, one of the 3 most powerful men in the world, was watching his son's severed head being paraded in front of his army. Can you imagine that moment? The psychological impact on both Crassus personally and on his soldiers was absolutely devastating. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete breakdown of everything the Romans thought they knew about warfare. But Serena wasn't finished, not even close. The young Parthian general had just demonstrated the first part of his tactical masterpiece: isolate and destroy Roman detachments. Now came part two: systematically destroy the main army through attrition. The arrow storm resumed with even greater intensity. Parthian horse archers continued their deadly circles, maintaining perfect range while raining death down on the trapped Romans. Hour after hour under the blazing desert sun, with no water, no shade, and no apparent way to strike back at their tormentors. Roman discipline, legendary throughout the ancient world, was beginning to crack. Here's what you have to understand about Roman soldiers. They were trained to fight, not to die slowly under a hail of arrows they couldn't return. Give a Roman legionary an enemy to charge, a battle line to break, a wall to storm. He'd follow orders without question, but this was like being slowly tortured to death in front of 40,000 witnesses. Crassus tried everything he could think of to break the Parthian stranglehold. He ordered formation changes, trying to minimize casualties from the arrow barrage. He attempted several more charges, hoping to force the Parthians into the close combat where Romans excelled. Nothing worked. The Parthians simply refused to fight on Roman terms. Every time the legions advanced, the horse archers retreated, maintaining their perfect killing distance. Every time the Romans tried to regroup, the arrows resumed their deadly rain. And then, as the sun began to set on what had already been the longest, most miserable day in Roman military history, Serena made his final masterstroke. The cataphracts charged. But this wasn't like medieval cavalry charges you might imagine from movies. These weren't knights looking for individual glory in single combat. This was a coordinated assault by 1,000 heavily armored horsemen, each wielding an 18-foot lance, hitting the Roman line like a steel avalanche. Roman shields and armor designed to protect against swords and javelins were no match for the focused impact of a cataphract charge. The 18-foot lances could punch through multiple layers of protection, killing several men with a single thrust. This is it, the moment we've been building to. The Roman line shattered. Not broke, shattered. Disciplined legionaries who had never retreated from anything began to run in absolute panic. The famous Roman formation, tested in hundreds of battles across Europe and Asia, simply disintegrated under the combined pressure of continuous archery and the psychological shock of the cataphract charge. Marcus Crassus, watching his life's work and his son's life destroyed in front of his eyes, finally understood the full magnitude of his disaster. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was the complete annihilation of everything he had built, everything he had dreamed of, everything he had sacrificed to achieve. But even in that moment of total despair, the old Roman fighting spirit flickered one last time. Crassus managed to rally perhaps 10,000 survivors and conduct a fighting withdrawal toward the town of Carrhae itself. It was a desperate move, trying to reach the walls before the Parthians could complete their destruction of the Roman army. Some made it, most didn't. The Parthians harried the retreating Romans all the way to the town walls, continuing their deadly archery until the very last moment. By the time the survivors stumbled through the gates of Carrhae, Marcus Licinius Crassus commanded fewer than 10,000 men. Out of the 40,000 he had led into Parthian territory, 30,000 Romans, dead, captured, or scattered across the desert. It was the greatest single-day disaster in Roman military history. But the worst part? This was only the beginning. In the silence that followed that catastrophic day at Carrhae, Marcus Crassus faced the most brutal reality check of his entire life. He was trapped in a foreign city with the remnants of a destroyed army, facing an enemy who had just proven that all of Rome's military assumptions were wrong. Everything he thought he knew about warfare, about Roman superiority, about his own capabilities as a general, all of it had been shattered in a single day. And the Parthians weren't done with him yet. Surena, having achieved one of the most complete tactical victories in military history, now faced a strategic decision: finish off the survivors or use this moment for something even more valuable than mere slaughter. What happened next reveals the sophisticated political mind behind Parthia's military genius. Rather than simply starving out the Romans in Carrhae, Surena sent a message under a flag of truce. He wanted to negotiate. Now you might think this was mercy. It wasn't. This was strategy at the highest level. Surena understood that capturing or killing Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's 3 most powerful leaders, would send a message that would echo across the ancient world. This wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about establishing Parthian credibility as a great power capable of standing toe-to-toe with Rome itself. The negotiations that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Surena offered safe passage for the Roman survivors. If Crassus would agree to come out and meet him personally to discuss terms, it seemed reasonable. After all, what choice did Crassus have? But Crassus's subordinates smelled a trap. His officers, what was left of them, pleaded with him not to trust Parthian promises. They'd already seen what Parthian honor looked like on the battlefield. Here's where Marcus Crassus made the final fatal decision of his life. Despite every warning, despite every instinct screaming danger, he chose to meet with Surena personally. Why? Pride. The same burning pride that had driven him to seek military glory in the first place now prevented him from admitting that he was completely at his enemy's mercy. He couldn't bear the thought of cowering behind city walls while a barbarian half his age dictated terms to Rome's greatest financier. So he rode out to meet Surena, accompanied by a small guard of his most trusted officers. What happened at that meeting? Well, let's just say Parthian hospitality wasn't quite what Roman diplomacy expected. The moment Crassus and his escort came within reach, the Parthians abandoned all pretense of negotiation. This had been a trap from the beginning, designed not just to eliminate the Roman leadership, but to do it in the most humiliating way possible. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who had crucified 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, who had built the greatest fortune in Roman history, who had been one of the 3 rulers of the civilized world, was cut down like a common bandit in the middle of the Syrian desert. But Surena wasn't satisfied with mere murder. He wanted to send a message that would be remembered for centuries. According to ancient sources, the Parthians cut off Crassus's head and filled his mouth with molten gold, a deliberate insult referring to his legendary greed. "You thirsted for gold in life," the symbolism said, "so drink gold in death." Whether this actually happened or was just propaganda spread afterward, the image was perfect. Rome's richest man, destroyed by the very greed that had made him famous. The surviving Roman soldiers, now completely leaderless and trapped, had no choice but to surrender unconditionally. Those who weren't killed outright were marched off into slavery, never to see Rome again. And here's the detail that makes this story even more incredible. Surena took the captured Roman standards, the sacred eagles that represented the honor and identity of each legion, and sent them as trophies to the Parthian king. Those eagles would remain in Parthian hands for decades, a constant reminder of Rome's greatest military humiliation. But what Crassus couldn't have known was how profoundly his death would reshape the Roman world. In the aftermath of Carrhae, the ancient world stood stunned. Rome, the seemingly unstoppable empire that had conquered the Mediterranean, had suffered its most devastating military disaster in living memory. But the real consequences were only beginning to unfold. First, there was the immediate strategic impact. The loss of 7 legions didn't just represent casualties. It represented a massive shift in the balance of power between Rome and Parthia. For the first time since the Punic Wars, Rome faced an enemy that had proven it could not just resist Roman expansion, but actually destroy Roman armies in open battle. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated over centuries of conquest, lay shattered in the Syrian desert. Parthia, meanwhile, had achieved something extraordinary. They had established themselves as Rome's equal in the ancient world's power structure. No longer could Romans dismiss them as just another barbarian kingdom to be conquered at leisure. But the political consequences back in Rome were even more dramatic. Remember the first triumvirate, the illegal conspiracy between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus that had effectively controlled the Roman Republic? With Crassus dead, that delicate balance of power was destroyed. Suddenly, there were only two men left to divide the Roman world between them. And as anyone who's studied Roman history knows, two powerful Romans sharing power is even less stable than three. Caesar was still in Gaul, wrapping up his conquest and building the military reputation that would make him legendary. Pompey was in Rome, consolidating his political position and his relationship with the conservative senators. Without Crassus to serve as a buffer between them, these two ambitious men were set on a collision course that would tear the Roman Republic apart. The civil war that would destroy the Republic and create the empire wasn't just inevitable after Carrhae. It was imminent. But there's another consequence that's even more fascinating to consider. What if Crassus had succeeded? Imagine if Roman legions had marched all the way to India, just as Alexander the Great had done 3 centuries earlier. Imagine if Roman engineering and organization had been combined with the wealth and trade routes of Central Asia. The entire course of world history would have been different. There might never have been a Roman Empire as we know it, because Rome itself might have shifted eastward, following the money and opportunity that successful conquest would have provided. Instead, Crassus's failure locked Rome into a Mediterranean focus that would define Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. And what about Surenna, the brilliant young general who had achieved this impossible victory? Here's where the story takes an ironic twist that seems almost too perfect to be true. Surenna's victory over Crassus made him incredibly popular in Parthia. So popular that King Orodes II began to see him as a potential threat to the throne. Within a year of his greatest triumph, Surenna was executed by the very king he had served so brilliantly. Such is the fate of successful generals in autocratic systems. Victory can be just as dangerous as defeat, but the Battle of Carrhae had consequences that went far beyond the immediate political situation. Roman military thinking was permanently changed by this disaster. Never again would Roman generals assume that traditional tactics would work against every enemy. The disaster in Parthia forced Rome to develop new strategies, new formations, and new approaches to warfare. Future Roman expeditions to the east would be much more carefully planned, better supplied, and more respectful of Parthian capabilities. It took decades, but Rome eventually did learn how to fight effectively against Parthian cavalry tactics. The cultural impact was equally profound. Roman poets and historians would reference Carrhae for centuries as the ultimate example of hubris punished by the gods. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed, overconfidence, and underestimating your enemies. And in Parthia, the victory became a foundational myth of national pride. For centuries afterward, Parthian kings would invoke the memory of Surenna's triumph as proof that their empire could stand as an equal to any power in the world. The captured Roman standards became almost holy relics, displayed in Parthian temples as symbols of their greatest military achievement. Looking back across the centuries, it's clear that Carrhae was one of those rare battles that actually changed the trajectory of human history. Looking back across the centuries at this incredible disaster, we have to ask ourselves, what does the Battle of Carrhae tell us about power, ambition, and the price of underestimating your enemies? Marcus Licinius Crassus had everything that Roman society valued: wealth beyond imagination, political influence, military experience, and the respect of his peers. By every measure his society recognized, he was one of the most successful men who had ever lived. And yet none of it was enough to satisfy his burning need for the one thing he couldn't buy: military glory on par with Caesar and Pompey. Sound familiar? It should. Throughout human history, we see the same pattern repeated again and again. Successful people who risk everything they've built in pursuit of the one achievement that has eluded them. Think about modern business leaders who destroy profitable companies chasing unrealistic growth. Think about politicians who throw away solid careers on impossible campaigns. Think about anyone who has ever said, "I have everything I need, but I want more." Crassus represents a very human failing. The inability to be satisfied with extraordinary success because someone else has achieved something different. But the Battle of Carrhae teaches us something even more important about the dangers of assumptions in warfare and life. The Romans approached this campaign with centuries of successful experience behind them. Their military system had conquered Gauls, Germans, Spaniards, Greeks, and dozens of other peoples. It was natural, almost inevitable, that they would assume the same tactics would work against the Parthians. This is what military historians call fighting the last war. You prepare for the enemy you know how to beat, not necessarily the enemy you're actually facing. The Parthians, meanwhile, understood something that the Romans had forgotten. Adaptation beats tradition. Rather than trying to match Roman strength with Parthian strength, they developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize Roman advantages. They turned Roman discipline into a weakness by making it impossible for the Romans to come to grips with their enemy. They turned Roman formation fighting into a liability by refusing to engage in formation fighting. They made Roman armor less effective by using weapons specifically chosen to penetrate Roman defenses. In business, in technology, in politics, in warfare, the same principle applies. The most dangerous competitors aren't the ones who try to beat you at your own game. They're the ones who change the game entirely. What's truly remarkable about Carrhae is how completely it reversed the expected outcome. By every conventional measure, Rome should have won this campaign easily. They had more soldiers, better equipment, superior logistics, centuries of military experience, and a commander who had already proven himself in major conflicts. Parthia had a smaller force, fighting on their home territory, led by a young general who had never faced the Roman military machine before. And yet the result wasn't even close. It was a complete, overwhelming, undeniable catastrophe for Rome. This tells us something profound about the nature of conflict itself. Preparation, resources, and experience matter, but they don't guarantee victory. Sometimes the most important factor is simply understanding the specific challenge you're facing better than your opponent understands it. Serena grasped something about Roman weaknesses that the Romans themselves didn't realize they had. He saw opportunity where everyone else saw Roman strength. But perhaps the most important lesson from Carrhae is about the relationship between success and wisdom. Crassus's previous victories had taught him that wealth and determination could overcome any obstacle. His success against Spartacus had convinced him that he understood warfare at the highest level. His political achievements had shown him that he could outmaneuver any opponent. All of these lessons were true, in the context where he had learned them. But context matters. What works in one situation can be catastrophically wrong in another. The Romans had spent centuries perfecting tactics for fighting European enemies. Those tactics were brilliant for fighting Gauls and Germans. They were suicide against Parthian horse archers. Success can blind us to our limitations. Victory can teach us the wrong lessons. Strength can become weakness if we don't understand when and how to adapt it. Marcus Licinius Crassus learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. But his disaster teaches us something valuable. No matter how successful we've been, no matter how confident we feel, no matter how many times our approach has worked before, we ignore new challenges at our peril. The desert sands of Carrhae hold more than the bones of Roman soldiers. They hold a timeless warning about the price of overconfidence and the danger of fighting tomorrow's battles with yesterday's strategies. And perhaps that's the most fitting monument to one of history's greatest military disasters. Not just remembering what happened, but understanding why it still matters today. So I have to ask you, after hearing this incredible story of ambition, disaster, and the price of overconfidence, What strikes you most about Marcus Licinius Crassus? Do you think his fate was sealed by his greed for gold or by something deeper? That very human need to prove himself in the one arena where he'd never truly succeeded? Here's what I find absolutely fascinating. Crassus had literally everything that Roman society could offer. Wealth beyond imagination, political power, military victories, the respect of his peers. And yet none of it was enough because Caesar and Pompey had achieved something he couldn't buy. Military glory that would echo through the ages. Does that remind you of anyone in our modern world? Think about tech billionaires launching space companies, or business moguls buying sports teams, or politicians risking everything for one more campaign. There's something deeply human about never being satisfied with the success you have when you can see someone else has achieved something different. But here's an even more intriguing question. What if Crassus had succeeded? Imagine Roman legions marching all the way to India, following Alexander's footsteps, but with Roman organization and engineering. Imagine Roman roads connecting the Mediterranean to the Silk Road, Roman law governing trade routes from Spain to China, Roman cities rising in Central Asia. The entire trajectory of world history would have been different. There might never have been a Roman Empire as we know it, because Rome might have become something even larger, a truly global superpower spanning 3 continents. Instead, one disastrous day in the Syrian desert locked Western civilization into a Mediterranean focus that would define the next 1,000 years of human history. And what about Surena? Here's a brilliant young general who achieved the impossible. He destroyed a Roman army using tactics that completely revolutionized ancient warfare. He proved that mobility could triumph over strength, that adaptation could defeat tradition, that a smaller, smarter force could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. And his reward, execution by his own king within a year because success made him too dangerous to the established order. There's something tragically perfect about that irony. The man who saved Parthia from Roman conquest was ultimately destroyed by the very system he had fought to protect. But perhaps the most haunting question of all, could this disaster have been prevented? What if Crassus had listened to the Senate's warnings? What if he had taken the omens seriously? What if he had studied Parthian warfare before invading their territory? What if he had brought more cavalry, better supplies, different tactics? Or was he doomed from the moment he decided that wealth and political success weren't enough? That he needed military glory to complete his legacy? Looking at the choices Crassus made step by step, it's hard to see where he could have turned back. Each decision seemed logical at the time. Each step forward seemed like the only way to avoid admitting failure. That's perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire story. How a series of seemingly reasonable decisions can lead to absolute catastrophe. The Battle of Carrhae reminds us that history isn't just about great forces and inevitable outcomes. It's about individual human beings making choices, sometimes brilliant choices, sometimes terrible ones, that echo across centuries. Marcus Licinius Crassus thought he was writing his own legend when he crossed the Euphrates in 53 BC. He was just not the legend he intended. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence, the price of underestimating your enemies, and the terrible cost of never being satisfied with extraordinary success. But it's also a story about the unpredictability of human conflict, the power of tactical innovation, and the way a single battle can change the course of civilization itself. The next time you hear someone say, "That's impossible," or "It's never been done before," or "They don't have a chance," remember the young Parthian general named Surena who proved that impossible victories are sometimes just waiting for someone smart enough, bold enough, and creative enough to achieve them. And remember Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had everything Rome could offer, but discovered too late that sometimes everything isn't enough. The desert sands of Carrhae still whisper their ancient warning. Beware the price of ambition, respect your enemies, and never assume that yesterday's victories guarantee tomorrow's success. Because in the end, History belongs not to those who have the most resources, but to those who understand the battle they're actually fighting. What lesson from this ancient disaster speaks most powerfully to you? What parallels do you see in our modern world? And if you were advising Crassus at the moment of his greatest decision, would you have been able to convince him to turn back from the path that led to Carrhae? Let me know in the comments below. These ancient stories of human ambition, triumph, and tragedy connect us across the centuries, and your insights help bring them to life for everyone. Until next time, keep exploring the incredible stories that shaped our world.